Welcome to the second of 3 webinars in the series, Response and Resilience in Supply Chains Amid COVID-19. It's focused on supply chain disruption amid the coronavirus. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School. And also thank you to our supporters, Australasian Supply Chain Institute, ASCI, the MGSM Alumni Association, and Centre for Workforce Futures. We'd like to begin with a quick technical overview to make sure that everyone is aware and comfortable with how they can provide questions in this forum. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, please send it via the Q&A button. And also, if you're having technical issues, Billy Bruce from our team is here. Either email him or send him a message on the Zoom Q&A button. Thank you, Billy. My name is Norma Harrison, and I'm the Professor of Management at Macquarie Business School in Macquarie University. I'm going to serve as the moderator for our session today. We've got a great team here providing support for this webinar. I'm assisted by Razia Tavalui and Roger Moser from Macquarie Business School. We welcome your questions and observations, and we'll try and answer as many of them as we can. The second webinar is called Weathering the Storm, where we look at strategies for surviving and thriving in turbulent and uncertain times. And in this webinar, we have an interesting selection of organizations represented. On the one hand, we have a service provider, BaptistCare, providing a very necessary and essential service. They already have a number of challenges to cope with on a day-to-day basis. They never would have thought that their supply chains would have been stretched to such an extent that it has been. Then we have a high-tech leader in innovation, an exemplar in Australian design and manufacturing and recognized around the world. Cochlear is known for its bionic ear. We like to say that. Would such a company need to reconsider its business model and reconfigure its supply chain? Then we have a professional supply chain institute, ASCI, representing not only large corporate members, but also a great supporter of small and medium-sized enterprises. What can we learn from them today on surviving and thriving in these difficult times? I'd like to start off with an introduction to our 3 panelists. So panelists, we have Meighan Hurd from BaptistCare, James Scotland from ASCI, and Greg Bodkin from Cochlear Limited. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Meighan Hurd, who's both a lawyer as well as a manager. Meighan Hurd actually is one of our top MBA students in the Macquarie Business School. So let me put you on to Meighan, and you might.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Norma, for that introduction. You might wonder at first instance why the General Manager for Governance and Legal is here talking about supply chain issues today. And if I just give you a little bit of context around that, I sit on the executive team at BaptistCare, and when we entered into our crisis management state for our response to COVID-19, what we did as the executive is we divvied ourselves up, those of us who don't sit in the operational lines, to assist and support other areas. So I found myself in a role that was linked with the procurement team, and sort of worked with the procurement team throughout the last few months, and wider representatives from the organisation in our response. So if I just give you a little bit of information about BaptistCare, Norma, if you can move on. So BaptistCare is a large Australian not-for-profit. We have 3,500 staff operating in the states of New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. We're part of a wider network of BaptistCare organisations around the country. In addition to our 3,500 staff, we have around 1,000 volunteers who work with us throughout the year. We have around 19,500 customers, and we operate across 4 divisions. If you want to move on, Norma, the next slide gives a bit of a breakdown around our operating divisions. Our largest division is residential aged care. So we operate 18 residential aged care homes. Then we have a large home care or community care operating line as well, and a couple of smaller divisions, so retirement living and social and affordable housing, plus a community services division. So we're a fairly diverse organisation. Back in March this year, we were the first aged care provider in Australia to experience a coronavirus outbreak. Aged care has been very well reported on around the world because of the challenges that have been associated with an outbreak of this nature in a home. So our outbreak began on the 3rd of March. It ended on the 7th of May. And during that time, we had 16 of our residents and 5 of our staff who tested positive to COVID-19. And quite heartbreakingly, we lost 6 of our residents to the virus. One of the really big challenges that we faced during the outbreak was the personal protective equipment levels that we needed to maintain in the home throughout that time. You'll see some pictures up here of some of those items. So gloves, masks, gowns, sanitizer, goggles, and clinical waste became really important. At its peak, we were running through significant amounts of PPE each day at the home. And part of the reason for that was that our staff, before they entered anybody's room to see any of the residents, then they needed to kit up and then kit down when they were coming in and out of that room. So 800 gowns is a huge number of disposable gowns that we were going through every day. And you can see the numbers there for the other key items. We faced a number of key challenges, not only at Dorothy Henderson Lodge, but also throughout the balance of our operating divisions. One of those was, after seeing the volumes that we were going through at that particular site, we worked out we needed to spend a little bit of time determining what our needs were. Given this is an unprecedented situation, there was a lot of discussion in each of our divisions about what was needed to be kept centrally, what was needed to be kept on the ground. For our community care workers, our home care workers who are travelling around constantly, did they need kits of PPE in their boots of their cars so that they had it available? So determining needs was a big challenge for us. The availability of stock was also a challenge. I think there's been plenty of reporting around the world of the challenges that organisations and health systems had faced in sourcing the PPE that they needed, and we were no different. So we faced critical shortages in stock and needed to be creative about how we obtain what we need. The volume was also sort of unprecedented levels for us. We don't typically hold a lot of all of these items on site, certainly not the volumes that we identified that we needed. So sourcing the volumes was a challenge too. And the other thing that was interesting was trying to get stock with the right specifications. So when we had trouble obtaining stock locally, we looked overseas and we looked to direct source some of this equipment from China. And one of the challenges was finding masks, gowns, etc., that met the Australian specifications. So we were told on a couple of occasions that the stock met US standards or it met UK standards, and there was a little bit of extra work before we could be satisfied that it was meeting the Australian standards. And there's lots of commonality between those standards, but also some differences. And the last couple of challenges I've identified here are the speed. So because there were issues around availability and there were challenges with the volumes of stock that we required, getting that level of stock and that range of stock within the time we needed it was tricky. And so we had to make some decisions about the extent to which we air freighted stock across from China and the extent to which we waited for that stock to arrive by sea. So some interesting challenges there. Lastly, our support systems. So we don't have particularly sophisticated support systems around our procurement, logistics and supply chain management. So we had to look at putting in place some other systems to help us manage. But there were some strengths. So some of the strengths that we identified quickly and that we could draw upon were relationships. So we have some excellent relationships with our key suppliers. And what we found was, because we had spent a lot of time investing in those relationships, then when push came to shove in a crisis situation, those suppliers stood with us. And, in the most part, they were quite responsive to our needs and gave us the preferential response we sometimes required. That wasn't across the board. So the experience was a little bit telling around, who really valued their relationships with us and where maybe those relationships were not quite as strong as we expected. The other thing was our relationships with the New South Wales Department of Health. They went from strength to strength throughout the crisis for us, and now we have a much better relationship. We put out our tentacles early and we got connected with the bunker. The bunker is a New South Wales Health location where they're holding stock. So we had a direct line of communication with them. The last thing I mentioned on here is the attitude. So one of the things about our organisation that I've been really impressed with during this phase is just the can-do attitude. So everybody jumped in and the goal was to be really focused on what we needed and to get it. So attitude, I think, makes a big difference. So I've talked about some of these things around how we managed our supply chain already. In terms of usage patterns and likely needs, we implemented a regular stock take. One of the things that we did is we got together a cross-functional team. So that was a team involving our property representatives, procurement representatives, and each of the operating divisions. And we spent a little bit of time clarifying roles and responsibilities. We also engaged a third-party logistics operator, so 3PL, for the first time, and set up a warehouse with stock that we decided we would keep in a central location and then divide up to the sites as needed.
So Meighan Hurd, in your particular industry, you've shown us your ongoing day-to-day challenges, but now you've been forced to respond to the extra challenges of the present pandemic. You've had to deal with supply chain issues, that is, your supplier relationships, so as to ensure regular supplies. Having now to consider the different tiers of the supply chain, not only your immediate tier one supplier, often your wholesalers within the country, but also directly with tier two and tier three suppliers upstream, say from China. You've also set up and enabled communication within the internal organization, your cross-functional teams. You've engaged a 3PL for transport and warehousing, and now thinking more seriously about safety stocks. So I'm interested to know, once this pandemic situation is relieved and shutdown conditions resume to normal, would it be business as usual for BaptistCare? Or is there a new normal for BaptistCare?
Yeah, thanks, Norma. So this whole situation has given us an opportunity to reflect on the way our procurement team operates inside the business and the way we manage some of our supply chain. So we're thinking about what improvements we might need to make with our procurement practices. We're thinking about, do we retain the cross-functional team that we've implemented? That's actually been very successful in terms of communications. And we're thinking about whether we move from probably what's best described as a lot of just-in-time procurement. So getting the things when we need it rather than having stock available, to having more kept on our sites or in central locations. So do we keep the third party logistics provider on board as well? And then I think the last thing it's good to reflect on as part of this whole sort of period of time is the sustainability issues. So up on the screen, you'll see a picture of a pile of contaminated waste. It's from a facility in China. I don't think it's any different to what those of us who've had to deal with outbreaks anywhere in the world have probably seen. And, you know, there are some big sustainability questions here, waste questions around the disposable items that we use. And I don't think we've got a better solution at this stage in how we might approach that differently in the future. Thanks, Meighan.
Thank you, Meighan. Thank you, Meighan Hurd. And we'll be back with you again for more questions during the panel, the panel discussion. Now I'd like to introduce you to James Scotland. James is the Queensland chapter president of the Australasian Supply Chain Institute. So go with it.
Thank you, Norma. My role is to talk about resilience and post-COVID in a sort of a more broader sense, and leave it to our two practitioners to talk about specifics. Just a quick word about ASCI, Australian Supply Chain Institute. The next slide shows that it's the professional accreditation body for supply chain. Our commitment, our dedication, our drive is to see supply chain management become highly professional and understood throughout industry. Anyone who wants to do some supply chain accreditation can do it in terms of the various aspects of supply chain. There's a couple there: production and inventory management, or logistics, transport and distribution, or they can do an end-to-end supply chain management course, certified supply chain professionals. The training is adaptive to your needs. The product's adaptive to your needs. It's all about helping you become more professional. We also spend a lot of time trying to get our head around thought leadership in this space, and we engage with our major and smaller members all the time. We're proud of our membership base, and we're proud of the information that we're able to provide to them and get from them. If anyone wants to know more about ASCI, just go to the website asci.org.au. New courses are starting in July. This is the time to be looking at your supply chain knowledge. We know from talking to our members and from our thought leadership issues that the biggest issue is we can't do business today the way we did it yesterday and still be in business tomorrow. And I think Meighan just highlighted that extremely well. You know, we were in an age of disruption and digitalization pre-COVID, and I find it amusing that COVID has disrupted the disruptions, but that doesn't mean the disruptions aren't still there. We're actually seeing a convergence of digital and the COVID issues coming together. And I think we need to accept this as the fundamental issue. We can't do business today the way we did business yesterday and still be in business tomorrow. All the indications are is that COVID is going to change our world. Here's 5 issues in supply chain that are driving some of that change. The first one is international freight. Australia is an island, a long way from the rest of the world. I spent a long time in the freight sector, and I know that it is basically inefficient to send planes and ships to Australia and back again. They're in the air or on the sea for a long time, where, you know, asset utilization for transport is loading, unloading and going again. Since COVID came in, it's been even worse. The international passenger flights have dropped off, almost disappeared completely, and won't happen again for quite a while. And international freight into Australia is limited and running currently at 5 times pre-COVID prices. Sea freight is out of sync. It's running into congestions around the major ports of the world, brought about by China ports closing in December and January, and then running into Chinese New Year in February. Sea freight is also getting overloaded, as Meighan said, because people are moving things from air freight onto sea freight because of the cost and the time. Freight is an issue for all of us, and we need to start thinking about what that means for our business. What does it mean for our inventory? What does it mean for our restocking ability? What does it mean for our purchase price? What does it mean for our distribution? Can we still service the international markets? There's a lot of talk going on about we need to be an island economy, sourcing from Australia and selling to Australia. That changes our thinking altogether. The other part of the second point is business closing. We're going to see a lot of businesses close over the next few months. You can't be closed down or be severely limited for 90 days or more and still survive. We've seen Hertz in America go broke. We've seen Virgin in Australia go into receivership. We've seen major retailing stores close down. And there's going to be a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises that just can't survive. This means there are market opportunities for fast-moving companies. But to do that, you need cash and you need resources, the two things that aren't available right now because there's not much trade going on. But companies that can take advantage of the market opportunities by their competitors closing will have a great success. The third issue affecting supply chain is the digital economy. It was coming fast anyway. We were dealing with the digital economy. No, not yet, please, Meighan. Norma, back again. We were dealing with the digital economy when COVID hit. And I think we've seen many of the issues that we've been talking about in digital come into being. We've started seeing a lot more, well, we've seen distributed workplaces, people working from home effectively. We've seen client meetings, client management meetings themselves being done via Zoom and other platforms. We're seeing the monitoring of businesses via digitalization rather than humans. We're seeing people are using virtual or augmented reality rather than flying in experts from overseas to service our machines. And we're seeing companies realize that digitalization and modern technology might be the answer to having the difficulty of having staff in close quarters with each other. Digitalization may be the go. We're seeing channel management become a key issue. And I was interested to hear what Meighan had to say about that. Our supply chains may have been solid for a while. We may have thought they were solid for a while, but with the difficulty of sourcing from overseas, the difficulty of getting it at the price that was agreed, the difficulty of our suppliers getting the stuff, and the difficulty of our suppliers just staying in business means that we need to rethink whether or not our relationships are strong. Likewise, our distribution networks, are they under financial stress? Are they staying in place? Are the markets staying where they were, or have they changed because of COVID? And all that means that we need to rethink our business plans. Our business plans need to change and adapt to all those factors which are going to be around for a while. Now, adding to that, and this is interesting, is that two of those issues were already a problem pre-COVID. Can the next slide, perhaps? We know from, at ASCI, we know from two very detailed reports that two of those issues were already an issue prior to COVID. The Grosvenor report of 2017 did an extensive study of procurement, how often buyers received the quality of delivery that they had contracted. And it found that the average was 74% of delivery. 26% of deliveries were not to spec. That's on $3 billion worth of purchasing. $3 billion worth of purchasing, $1 in 4 was not to spec. And in fact, many were down at 30%, a lot were below 50%, and only a few were up over 90%. The ones that were over 90% were the ones that had a relationship with their buyers, the ones that had a close affinity to the buyers. The supplier and the buyers worked together. The rest were either adversarial or transactional, and they suffered because they didn't build relationships. I enjoyed what Meighan had to say earlier about some suppliers did that. So this means that we have suppliers who are struggling to provide and survive, suppliers who are struggling to provide and supply. And we know that not all of our suppliers are good relationships with us anyway. So we need to think about how we manage our distribution, our supply chains. The other part was the State of Supply Chain Management Report 2020, developed by ASCI, found that most companies did not have an effective digital strategy to prepare for the future. Most companies said that their data was incomplete or altered constantly, or was on a transactional basis with suppliers and buyers rather than an integrated digital program, digital strategy for managing the whole business, including the supply chains, through digitalization and efficiency. This means that 2 out of the 5 issues that I raised earlier were already big issues. And then we throw in the 3 new ones, and we have major challenges to face in being a resilient and sustainable business post-COVID. I have 5 suggestions as to how we might make sure that our businesses are more resilient. The next slide, perhaps, please.
Before you go on to the next slide, James,
Yeah.
I'm noting your second point there, that not many digitalization is not being implemented by large and small companies. You know, we read and we hear quite a bit about reimagining the supply chain in the digital economy. There are many instances internationally of advancements in the application of big data or data analytics, the Internet of Things, AI, cybersecurity, blockchains, etc. Right? So I am very curious as to why you would say that companies are not digitalizing as fast as would be expected. Would you be referring to Australian companies or generally?
The report, which, by the way, quick ad, is again available at asci.org.au, was an Australian research piece. So yes, it was Australian companies. In my own work in supply chains over the last 5 years, and in referencing the report, there's probably 3 issues. One is that the larger companies in Australia, not necessarily global companies, but Australian larger companies, have major legacy issues with data. They have 5, 6, 7, 20 legacy systems that they're trying to bring together before they can even go out to their supply chains to bring them together. Newer companies don't have this issue, but the more structured last century businesses are struggling with legacy. And the smaller businesses, much to my chagrin, the smaller businesses are still saying they haven't seen a business case for full digitalization. This drives me crazy. We sit at home and we use digital platforms and apps to purchase flights overseas and holidays and football tickets and meals and everything. We use digitalization at home. And then when we go to work, we say, oh, I'm not sure about this digital business. I like doing it the way I used to do it. The business case is this. You can say you are the world's best, cheapest maker of wooden tires for horse and cart, but round the corner are cars. You don't need a business case to go to cars. Just look around the corner and say, what you're doing now is out of business in a few years. You can't do business today without doing it tomorrow. We need to help Australian businesses understand this is not a might do, this is a must do. We haven't done that yet.
Thank you.
So here's 5 things that we can do to start getting ready. The first thing is we need to get ready for the digitalized COVID world. It's going to be Darwinian. The strong are going to survive. The first thing we need to do is get our data accurate. We know that many businesses are reviewing the way they're doing their business. So are we really sure that our suppliers, their suppliers, their suppliers, our channels to market, our markets, are we really sure they're accurate? Are we sure that the information on our staff are accurate? Are we sure that our finances are accurate? This is the time to start getting everything accurate. That idea about legacy systems is get into them, find out what's going on. The data is going to save us in a world where it's where some businesses are going broke and the staffing issues are difficult. The second thing we need to do is have a revised business model. It doesn't work. The old way is not going to work. Just our operating within our own business just our operating processes need to change, but we need to change the way we deal with our suppliers, our businesses, our competitors. We need to think about where we sit in this new world where some companies are dropping off, where market opportunities are opening up, where our suppliers are struggling. Our supplies are hard to get in here. Are we going to be an island economy operator? Are we going to try and continue to be a global operator? Think about your model. Start thinking about business models. The third thing is, as I've said, is we need to engage our suppliers. They are struggling to get supplies. They are struggling to survive. They are struggling to provide you with what you need. And your relationship with them almost certainly isn't as good as what you think it is if you go on the Grosvenor report. So talk to your suppliers, bring them into the tent, make them part of your solution. Bring them into the solution question. The fourth question for me is brand values. The companies that will survive will be the ones that can mount an argument to the markets, to government, to their suppliers, to the people on the street, that they're the ones that should. We are the Australian company working with Australians, trying to survive in Australia. We're with you. We're all in this together. We need to start looking at the values that we're putting out as a brand and making sure it aligns with what we need to do in the post-COVID environment. The fifth thing I suggest we have a look at is become fully connected. How much stress are your suppliers in? How much stress is your market in? Can they keep operating? Do you need to help them? What's the question? And then start looking at ways in which you can be much more efficient through digitalization and technology. And lastly, cash wins. Cash is going to survive here. If you are still operating a business model back in number 2 that is based on return on fixed assets, you're probably going to struggle to survive in the fast-moving, pivoting world of COVID. Get your cash in. Make sure that you are a cash-based balance sheet and get ready to move into the future. 6 things based on the 5 challenges we're facing. I hope that's been interesting, Norma.
Thank you, James Scotland. I think you've caused a lot of questions to be arisen later on, and I think some interesting ones are going to come along. So at this stage, I would like to introduce Greg Bodkin. Greg Bodkin is the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain and Operational Excellence in Cochlear Limited.
Thanks, Norma. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are in the world. So I do work for Cochlear. We're the leader in implantable hearing solutions globally. We have more than 550,000 devices with customers at the moment, and we help people from the age of 12 months through to people well into their 90s try and lead a full and active life by helping them get their hearing or regaining their hearing. Critical to what we do is our mission, and that is we help people hear and be heard. And we do that by 3 things. We empower people to connect with others in society and live a full life. We try and help transform the way people understand and treat their hearing loss, because hearing loss is a really important part of their overall health, and it's important that it is treated. And then probably core to what people maybe know us for is innovation and research development, and we do bring products to market that are unique, very good, and deliver a lifetime of hearing outcomes. Next slide. So during COVID, it was quite a challenge. I think it's an understatement, but we focused on 3 things, and I think this really helped us get through the last few months. That was firstly to provide a safe place of work for our employees. We had both, I had 500 people still turning up every day across New South Wales and Queensland in the supply chain, but we also had a lot of employees and obviously working from home. But so we're very conscious of making sure our employees were safe. To keep our supply chain open, because we needed to keep our customers on the air, and where surgeries were still taking place, we needed to make sure supply. So our product, it is critical. If someone has a problem with their product, they can't hear. So it was really critical that we maintained our supply chain during this time. And lastly, to protect the financial well-being. If Cochlear wasn't strong financially, then we can't realise our mission, and also it's difficult to provide job security to our staff. And so we did go to the market and raise some capital. So some of the challenges that we faced, as I said, retaining our supply chain operations open and running, health and well-being, so making sure that we were helping people be safe and healthy during that period as they came to work and were at work. We had to change work patterns and operating procedures in light of the requirements that were being put out and had to be mandated and met. And in some cases, securing government approvals and exemptions to allow our people to come to work when the directions were to work from home if you could. A lot of work went on to tactically keep our supply chain just open and running. Maintaining the supply from our external suppliers, firstly in China, because that's obviously where the impact of the COVID virus started. And we have a number of critical suppliers that supply product from China into Australia. But then that pretty quickly transferred into Europe and then the US, where we also have a number of key suppliers. So working very closely with them to keep our supply of what we needed open. The logistics channels, yes, to keep our customers on the air, we had to be able to move product around the world. And luckily we have a very deep relationship with UPS. And so we were able to keep those logistics channels open and product into our global distribution centres. And then sort of coping with the sudden drop in demand, because as the virus escalated, and for our business, the stopping of elective surgeries basically shut down all our demand, most of it anyway, in a number of really, really critical markets. So, having to respond to that drop in demand back in the supply chain. What do we do with our capacity? Do we keep running? How do we slow it down? How do we handle that drop in demand? And so then balancing this capacity utilisation versus inventory versus the retention and having the ability to respond, because we went through a phase of protecting the business. We're now probably coming out of protection and going into rebuild, and in some markets even growing again. So it was a pretty tricky situation to get that balance right, especially then when you look at the next dot point around what's the future demand look like. The level of uncertainty in the world was incredible. So what capacity do we keep in place? How do we set that? How do we keep that flexibility? How do we keep the agility? But also how do we manage the cost? There was the drop in demand led to impacts to purchase volumes. So of course our supplier relationships became critical. We spend a lot of time working very deeply with our suppliers, so they understand our business and we understand theirs, so that when we need to have tough conversations, we are able to have those and we work through it together, because they understand that we're in this for the long term, and they like to be in a relationship with us for that long term. And then the last point was just really continually evaluating the supply chain risks. The situation in the environment was changing rapidly, and so how do you make sure that you are assessing your risks almost daily and taking steps to mitigate those risks.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide.
So Greg Bodkin, in this webinar, we could argue that supply chain management is now at an inflection point. This point is often the culmination of several factors like changes in technology or emergence of big data. Basically, it's a realization by many top managers that supply chains are essentially strategic rather than tactical in nature. So in Cochlear's supply chain, have you reached this inflection point?
Yeah, thanks, Norma. So maybe next slide. So look, I think it is an inflection point, or it's certainly a time to take stock of where we're at. We're looking at it in four sort of traits or four areas to consider. The first one is how responsive is the supply chain, is your supply chain? We run an integrated business planning process across our business, and that's from product all the way through to supply. And so we're looking at our IBP process now to make sure it is able to capture the changes to demand in this short to medium and long term, given the level of uncertainty that's occurring. So, having to shorten the horizon, but also make sure we don't lose sight of the longer term. Making sure our supply chain capacity is agile, so that if we need to flex up, we can, and if we need to flex down, we can. And we've had to do both in the last few months. And I would say that inventory is not always the evil it is sometimes called out to be. Inventory is a friend at the moment, and if you are clever and pragmatic and sensible, then inventory is a great way of protecting your responsiveness. The second element's around sustainability. So it really is about understanding the risks in your supply chain and to really deeper levels than you may have previously considered, getting down to that, as Meighan said, to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and really understanding where those risks are sitting in your end-to-end supply chain, having those strong external supplier relationships, and then also understanding the cost drivers in your supply chain, because you do need to understand what drives the cost, and that will help you make decisions around whether you singly source or dual source, or whether you hold inventory in one spot or more than one spot. So getting a very good clarity on what are those cost drivers in your supply chain. The third one is around transparency. And I think the data analytics, and the previous speaker talked about having good data. What data sets do you need to manage the supply chain? Developing that end-to-end visibility of performance through the supply chain in your supply chain organisation, but then making that performance visible to the rest of the organisation. Because in these times of uncertainty, and especially as demand changes, having your sales and commercial teams understanding how your supply chain is performing is critical to giving them confidence in going into the market and developing and growing the business. And the last point is really around innovation. From a Cochlear perspective, we are still maintaining a very strong R&D roadmap. We haven't pulled that back too much despite COVID. And so our supply chain will need to adapt to the introduction of new products and services. One of those is in the healthcare industry is certainly an accelerated shift towards remote care. So being able to care for patients without the need to have them present in person to a medical professional. And we have ability to do that. And so we are now accelerating that into sort of the regulatory approval cycles, but also into some of our markets where it already is approved. And then just understanding what process change and technology enablers are there to drive customer experience and reduce costs through greater digitalisation and automation of the supply chain. Next slide. So, look, I think how have we changed? What are we looking at? As I said, we've seen a need to be able to treat people or support the treatment of people remotely as social distancing became mandatory, but I think we potentially see this as a new ongoing requirement post the pandemic. How is patient delivery being done, and how does our end-to-end supply chain support that? In hospitals and with acousticians, their practices and requirements are changing as a result of COVID, and we think that will have some impacts to our supply chain design. Still working through that at the moment, but we expect some changes to be needed to be made. And still taking a fairly pragmatic approach to our supply chain. I mean, our overriding principle is never miss a surgery, never miss a switch on. So that's a key driver and motivator for how we take and design our supply chain response.
So Greg Bodkin, with these changes you've just mentioned, it seems that the business model under which Cochlear has operated is changing. Have you noticed this changed your business model as a result of COVID-19?
Yeah, look, I think it won't. Our business model won't change significantly. It'll be more fine-tuning it, and so we think of it in these three areas. What's our cost perspective versus our responsiveness perspective? And we will always design our supply chain to have a strong capability to be agile and respond and be flexible versus necessarily operating at the lowest cost. As I said, one of our guiding principles is never miss a surgery, never miss a switch on. And so agility and responsiveness is certainly a higher priority for us than cost. Risk versus uncertainty. So again, deeply understanding those risks in our supply chain. We're adapting our risk assessment models now to allow for some different lenses to look for uncertainty, take different perspectives on certainly external supply chain risks, and do more what-if scenario planning, and take measures to cover some of that risk. And then the last point is looking at our supply chain strategy to make sure our supply chain is really robust, and that we do not suffer disruptions to supply, and we have not had really one disruption to our supply chain through COVID. And so a lot of the work we've done over the last 2 or 3 years to make our supply chain robust is paying off. And so we will favour robustness versus optimality. And as I said before, that's making decisions around, do you singly source, do you dual source? That might come at a cost of unit pricing. but that cost is offset because you've got a more robust supply chain. So thinking about your supply chain like that, because as I said, our job is to ensure our customers can hear now. So we want to make sure people who want to get their hearing can, and then once they've chosen our product, to make sure that we keep them on air and so their hearing journey continues.
Thank you, Greg. So as the business models change, we can expect the supporting supply chains to change. And this is a real challenge for the strategic supply chain leader. So I noticed the time is going fast. And so what I'd like to do is for us to look at some of our takeaways from the 3 panelists that we've had. And I think the first one is looking at our partners within the supply chain. And I think we mentioned that, Meighan mentioned how it was very important to look beyond the tier 1, to look at the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, and also considerations of whether they're at the stage where they need to have a 3PL, a third-party logistics provider, on an ongoing basis. And then James, I think you are alluding to watching for the pivots. Do you want to say anything, James, here?
Well, the biggest word we've heard over the last 2 months is how businesses need to pivot based on COVID. And the question that I would put to everyone is to know which ones of your suppliers, or your distribution channels have pivoted away from you. They have seen a market opportunity and gone, and you may think that they're still there, but they're not sure, but they're not, they've gone somewhere else.
That's
also,
right.
who are your suppliers or suppliers who's previously had major customers that have now gone broke? Maybe one of your major suppliers serviced Virgin, and they're now in severe stress. Watch out for the pivots. That's going to hurt.
So engaging with your partners upstream and downstream is very important as well. And some of the possible conflicts that you could have in your decisions, and whether you are going to maintain your suppliers or think in terms of reducing your costs. And these could be some of the problematic decisions that you might have to make. Also, in terms of our people, we're thinking about reinvigorating Meighan, how that really improved having the company teams.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that a bit more. So, most organisations get accused of operating in silos on a day-to-day basis. And look, the last couple of months have really challenged us to work across teams and to solve problems together rather than trying to solve them on our own. So having that team, a combination of our sort of facilities management and property, with our procurement team, with the operating divisions working together, well, that's made a huge difference.
Right, thank you. And digital economy, we find here there's quite a few comments that we've had for the digital economy, how we need to really change our businesses to cope with that. And we can't, it's not just business as usual after the pandemic and shutdowns down. It doesn't mean that we just go back and operate as usual. And the other ones is thinking about our supply chains, rethinking inventory. And I think both Greg and James mentioned that. That inventory is really not exactly a bad thing. And sometimes you have to think about having more safety stock. Again, that is a balance between that and your cost of holding inventory. And then also business continuity plans and how that is quite important to keep the business moving rather than closing it down. And then revisiting our business model. So Greg gave us some interesting aspects about revisiting the business model and how that could change. And then I think looking at our emerging traits, the responsiveness, the sustainability, the transparency, and innovation. Those are the points that I think we need to remember. So moving on, do we have time for questions? Maybe we do. Some quick questions for Greg. This is from Peter Robertson. And what Peter says is, it has come out that several groups were warning about the risk of a pandemic for some years before COVID-19 broke out, but their warnings were not very well responded to. Does Cochlear have a risk management cycle as part of its management system? And if yes, then did such a process help with Cochlear's preparedness with the COVID-19 outbreak?
We do have a risk management cycle. We have a risk management process. We have a risk management committee, obviously, at the board. Did it help with the pandemic? I mean, we have the word pandemic in our risk response plan. So to some extent, I'll say the issue was covered, but not in the detail of which this pandemic hit us. What I would say is that understanding risk to your supply chain, you need to do that all the time. You can't wait for an event like this to suddenly try and respond. So other than social distancing and increased sanitisation and some very tactical things that we did within our own business and our plants, most of the things that protected our supply chain are things that we've been working on for the last 2-3 years. And so they really came to the fore in the last 3 months because we had those deep supplier relationships. We had dual sourcing in where we needed it. We had the right levels of inventory in where we needed it. We really did understand our supply chain deeply. So my encouragement is to all businesses, you don't wait for one of these events to try and get ready. You have to get ready all the time and be looking at your risks all the time because they actually do change quite regularly.
Mm-hmm.
May I support that, please,
Sure.
please, Norma, and
Sure.
thank you, Greg, for a great presentation and for supporting what I was saying. I think that you're an exemplar of exactly what we need to do to be resilient in these type of disasters. You need to have solid supplier engagements, as we saw in that slide about a way to make money is to have them engaged, not transactional. And you need to see supply chain as a strategic issue, and you need digitalisation. All of those things you've been doing, and I think that shows all of us how we survive and get and prosper in this environment.
Thanks, James.
Okay, so I think I've got one. Rebecca Murray has asked a question. Rebecca is chairing the MGSM Alumni Association, and she asks Meighan, Meighan Hurd, what, if anything, would you do differently given your new knowledge regarding supply chains during the pandemic?
So I guess the best way to answer that might be that we've been maturing our procurement supply chain management, for the past few years. And one of the things that this highlighted to us is that it would have been helpful if we'd gone a bit faster in doing that. So we've been talking about different systems. We've been talking about how we get more disciplined with our procurement practices. And I think if we'd gone with that a bit earlier, it would have meant that we were more organised through this process. And I think it's actually about speed. So if we'd known the things that we know now 2.5 months ago, then we could have implemented things faster than we'd done them than as we did them. But I don't know that we would change anything in particular from what we actually did.
Right, okay. I've got a question here. It's quite a curious one from Chris for James. James, in the pandemic, the digital tools was claimed to hinder the agility of actions to keep the supply chains operating. When the situation normalizes, do you foresee the companies going back to using digital tools with all the problems? James?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I'm not sure I agree that it hindered the response. I see maybe the two practitioners might have a better view. I see that digitalisation can be a real advantage to us in the future. It can help us address the previous human contact functions with maybe some sort of a digital approach. it might help us become an island economy a bit stronger because we can use technology. I think our infrastructure's worked well. I'm not sure I understand what digital issues have hindered COVID.
Okay, so this is good. They can contact you directly, and then you can have a bit of a conversation on this.
Yeah, interesting. No, but also like to know what the other two think. Has digitalisation hindered you or been assistance in trying to manage non-human interaction?
Meighan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would say no. Digitisation hasn't hindered us. In fact, we probably wish we had a bit more of it.
Okay. All right. I think at this particular time, Greg, do you have something to say?
No, it was critical for us. I mean, we sent, in the space of a day, we sent nearly 500 people home and started to work from home. And so just that example, we rolled out Microsoft Teams in the space of 9 days. If we didn't have some of that technology, we would not have actually been able to work. So I don't, certainly digitalisation has been an aid to us, not a hindrance. That's what I would say.
Okay. Good. So at this stage, I think we really need to wrap it up. First, a huge thank you to our panelists, Meighan Hurd, James Scotland, Greg Bodkin. We really appreciate you sharing your organizational challenges and considerations for future directions. So glad to have you on my team, Razia Tavalui and Roger Moser. Really appreciate your great support. We're grateful to all our sponsors, Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School, and also thank you to our supporters, Australasian Supply Chain Institute, MGSM Alumni Association, and the Centre for Workforce Futures. Finally, I would like to thank you, the audience, for your interest and outstanding questions, and I apologize we could not get to all of them. Like we did for the first webinar, we will release the recording of this session to all those who have registered, and you are free to use it as illustrations and discussion points at your workplace and meetings. And what I'd like to do lastly is I would like to invite you to join us for our next webinar. This is webinar 3 in our series. And here we are looking at COVID-19, a post-mortem, and the lessons learned and moving forward. So in the meantime, before we see you again, take care of your families, your organizations and employees, and your supply chain partners. We wish you all the best. Take care.